Everybody, welcome to the School of Architecture and Planning. If you're visiting us, you have joined us on our Wednesday night lecture series. We are here most Wednesday nights for a public lecture, and occasionally on this screen the array of presentations for Wednesday nights will go by, and we have posters around the school, so we certainly welcome you to come back. Tonight is a special lecture. This lecture is endowed by Professor Ibrahim Jammal and his wife Vivian. Dr. Jammal was a founder of the Department of Urban and Regional Planning in the 1980s, and then he served as a faculty member for 30 years. He was a major force behind the study of globalization within the field of planning. And this is why we stick closely to a topic that's near and dear to his heart for these lectures. We honor his legacy in tonight's lecture. And I should also say that tonight's lecture is co-sponsored by the Food Lab here in the School of Architecture and Planning. We're very happy to have tonight with us Jane Battersby. She has come a long way to visit us. She flew in only yesterday from South Africa. She is a senior researcher at the African Center for Cities at the University of Cape Town. And her areas of research include urban food systems, urban food policy, and the construction of food security theory. And she does this in both northern contexts, southern contexts, developing countries, and everywhere. She has been the Cape Town partner of the African Food Security Urban Network since 2008. She's actively engaged in her research and scholarship at the international levels, national, provincial, and local governments. She has a PhD from Oxford University, a master's from Newcastle upon Tyne, and a bachelor's degree from King's College in London. And we're so happy to have Jane with us here tonight. So please help me welcome Jane Battersby.
Great, thank you. Great, thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. Can you hear me okay? Yep, great. So, as you just heard, I flew in from Cape Town yesterday. It was a 36-hour journey, and I've no idea quite what time zone I'm on. So if I get a little fuzzy, please give me a little bit of grace on that. I'm really happy to be here because I've been following the work of the Food Lab in Buffalo for some time. So it's really exciting for me to be here, and I had a really interesting tour of some of the sites today. So I feel I have a little bit more of a context of where I'm speaking into. But you have no idea of the context of which I'm speaking out of. So just by way of introduction, I work for the African Center for Cities, which is a research and policy unit at the University of Cape Town. And our goals are basically to provide credible knowledge on the drivers of urban crises in African cities with an eye on systemic solutions. And food is one of those components. We're trying to develop capacity development tools that are going to enable better governance, and we are trying to undertake targeted advocacy with influential development agencies that shapes the urban development agenda in Africa and the global south. So our eye is always on real applied research within the African cities and taking that out to the wider community, taking it out to wider national governments, and then beyond. And so then we've been working on food for the last 10 or so, well, 15 or so years. And we started with the African Food Security Urban Network, which was a Canadian project working in 11 cities in 9 southern African countries. And it was the first time that we'd really tried to get the urban food issue onto the political agenda. So the purpose had threefold. The first one was to get some credible data on the extent and nature and drivers of food insecurity in African cities, for the simple reason that for the last 30 or so years, the framing of food insecurity and the food problem in Africa has been understood as one of rural problems, rural development issues, rural poverty issues. And we wanted to make the point that this is given the rapid urbanization and the urbanization of poverty, food is one of those areas that you really need to focus on. So partly it was around generating data. The second one was to ask some fundamental questions about how are cities in Africa designed and governed in such ways that either enhances or hinders food insecurity. And so we've been working towards that and thinking about what are the intersections of the food system and the urban system? How does planning intersect with food? And then finally asking, well, what are some of the governance responses that we can co-generate out of that? And this is where we've been working for the last 10 years or so. As we've been working, some new questions have come onto the agenda. So when we started, it was primarily about food insecurity and the hunger framing of food insecurity. We've become increasingly aware of the triple burden of malnutrition, the rise of overweight, obesity, diabetes, hypertension, at the same time as having stubbornly high levels of infant stunting, things like underweight, anemia, etc. And so we've been working towards addressing those questions. We've also been working in a number of other projects. So the project that I'm going to be talking out of today is out of the Consuming Urban Poverty project, which tried to use food as a lens to understand and alleviate poverty in secondary cities. So those are actually the fastest growing cities in Africa, the smaller cities in 3 countries, in Kenya, in Zambia and Zimbabwe. I'm also working in the Hungry Cities Partnership and the Nourishing Spaces project. And I'll come back towards the end talking about the community of practice on food governance that we have in Cape Town at the moment. And so what I'll be doing is talking to you out of the context of one particular location that we've been working in. We've been working in Kitwe in Zambia, which is a it's the second largest city in Zambia. It's got a population of around 500,000, so it's not a small city by any measure. And it's historically a copper mining city which has gone under sort of collapse as the mining industry's faded and is now undergoing a little bit of a resurgence. And we started our work by looking at what it is that people consume in the city. We did a series of household surveys, household interviews, and then went back and kind of represented this pictorially. And this is the standard diet in a house in Kitwe in a low-income neighborhood. Not sure the pictures are, it's a little bit darker than on my screen, but what we have is a diet that's very simple, a diet that's based on maize meal as the staple, some leafy greens which are often grown either by the community or brought at the market, and reconstituted dried fish as a cheap source of protein. So we have quite a limited diet. It's not an unhealthy diet by any stretch, but it is a limited diet. And what we saw in the communities we worked in was that food insecurity levels were up at 90%. This is high food insecurity and very low dietary diversity. So you break all food types into 12, you ask who in the household has consumed any of these things within the last 24 hours, and the mean dietary diversity in the Kitwe survey was 3.25 out of 12. This is a tool that was developed by Fanta, and the cutoff as a proxy for malnutrition is 6 out of 12. So we're looking at high levels of malnourishment. We have exceptionally high levels of anemia, high levels of infant stunting. But with this very high food insecurity and this very low mean dietary diversity, we found that households were actually managing to feed themselves for much of the year. And so what there seems to be is a base level of food coming into the system that people can access, but there's very limited dietary diversity. And so the question is, why does this diet persist, and to what extent is urban design and urban planning playing into this? And so from there we went and did a whole series of retailer interviews and retailer mapping in the city, and looked at where the retailers are, what they're selling, and why they're saying they're doing what they're doing, and how they say that the state is impacting their ability to do what they want to do. Gosh, I feel I should be using more complex words than this, but I've had very little sleep, so forgive me on this. And so what I want to talk to you about tonight is a series of really bewildering decisions that are made by local government in African cities around food. I'll give you the bewildering thing, and then I'll try and unpack why those are happening. So the story tonight centers on a market in Kitwe, Chisukwane Market. Chisukwane Market is a very, very large market. It's got about 10,000 traders operating in it. It's in the center of the town. The market is overspilled, so the main market site is here. The market is overspilled into the CBD around where the formal retail sector is as well. And there's these 3 contradictory processes that are taking place: market upgrading, market relocation, and street trader clearances. So the first thing is there's these constant periodic episodes to try and improve the market, to try and upgrade the market. So in 2009, $1 million was granted to this by a project launched and managed by the City Council, UN Habitat, Ministry of Local Government, and DANIDA, the Danish International Development Agency. And $1 million was dedicated to upgrading the market. Nothing happened. 2012, another launch of it. And what we've seen is there's been this kind of sporadic efforts to try and improve the market, to try and address some of the concerns around safety and sanitation in the market. So it seems to happen every time there's a crisis. So in 2012, there was a fire and a reconstruction. 2016, we had the cholera outbreak and another form of upgrading. So there's this kind of process of incremental upgrading at times of crisis. At the same time as you've got this kind of ongoing effort to try and modernize that market, you've also got an effort to relocate the market. And so the Kitwe City Council has been making efforts to try and develop new markets on the periphery of the city to decant or even to completely remove the Chisukone market. So you've got an effort and a huge investment in upgrading the market at the same time as you've got these efforts to relocate. But the relocation has been largely unsuccessful. These are kind of unoccupied market stands that are in place. So far you can kind of see a logic of it. We're trying to upgrade and we're trying to kind of decant the market a little bit. But the third thing that happened during the process of our research was the relocation of street traders who had been operating in the city centre. These are street traders operating outside the ShopRite supermarket, which is a South African supermarket that's moved into the area. And when we started the research, this was the picture. When we went back 2 years later, all the street traders had been cleared. They had all been cleared into Chisukone market. So you have a market that's argued to be unsafe, unsanitary, overcrowded, that needs to be decanted and upgraded, at the same time as you're evicting all the street traders from the street into the market. It doesn't make any sense. And when we talked to the council, when we talked to other people in the city, there was not a single incidence of people thinking about this as a food systems issue. It was around sanitation, it was around public safety, it was around the economy, but it was never ever around food. And when we speak to government officials in any of the cities we work in, they argue that local government has little or no role in shaping the food system. And food security is argued to be an agricultural competence, nutrition is argued to be a health competence, and trade is argued to be a trade competence. There's no acknowledgement of the food system's impact of ordinary government activities. And so there's this kind of effort to try and think about, well, how do we start to integrate food into local government planning in the African context? And what we need to be really careful about is how we do this, and the danger of simply importing ideas from the global north is what seems to happen very often. We've got to be conscious of the fact that even though the local governments see that they don't really have a competence or a mandate around food planning, it's actually layered onto a history that is profoundly linked to the control of food in urban areas. And so I want to unpack a little bit of that history to help us understand why we've ended up with these conflicting ideas that are playing out, but also where it might lead us to some potential opportunities for change. And I'm going to talk to you about this through 3 vignettes of how the state has historically engaged food in cities. So the first is around urban agriculture. There's been a massive effort to try and get urban agriculture onto the urban agenda in Africa. The FAO, organizations like RUAF, have been instrumental in this. But local government has always been resistant. The pathways are slowly changing, but local government has historically been very resistant to urban agriculture. The one reason is around health and safety, concerns around that, but we often think that's a kind of a mask. So Drakakis Smith has written that within the city itself, illegal cultivation, like illegal trading, has proven to be an anathema to most city authorities, tarnishing it as it does with a modernizing image that they want to pursue. So the urban agriculture, the practice of agriculture in cities, is seen as something that's backwards, and the cities are striving towards modernization. And so it needs to be repressed on those grounds. But there's something deeper going on than that. Historically, urban agriculture was resisted because it was seen as interrupting the kind of primacy of agriculture as an engine of economic growth in African countries. And so if you were having this informal urban agriculture that was feeding into the system in different ways, it somehow represented a lack of state control over the food system. And so it was therefore resisted on the grounds of its kind of potential economic impact on agricultural development. So the control of food becomes about the control of the economy. The second case is about milling and food processing. And again, with a similar kind of story, the history of maize in Africa is about one of the encouragement of maize production to feed urban populations. And so you have this kind of maize marketing boards that are developed as part of the post-colonial developmentalism project. And what you see is that mills are zoned as an industrial activity, and the only milling that's legally available is that which is zoned within these industrial areas. And so the vision is very much of a large-scale productive system, a large-scale productive system feeding into a large-scale processing system that then goes through mandated markets. And so the individual small-scale hammer mills like these are illegal. Now we've seen the kind of collapse of those marketing boards and the kind of immersion of many more of these small-scale hammer mills, but they are still rendered illegal. The third is around retail and markets and street trade. And again, the control of markets and of street trade is fundamental to how control has been asserted in African cities. So for example, in Zambia, the 1937 Markets Act really controlled markets and market sites. It put markets under the control and management of local governments. It gave power to them to regulate market buildings, to regulate what could be sold, at what price they could be sold. It also gave them the right to inspect and grade goods. It also said that no person in any public place within a radius of 2 miles of the center of the market may sell any goods except in a market. And this therefore rendered any kind of street trading illegal. And so you have, from the images you've seen, you've had the market trading and the street trading both in operation in Kitwe. One is branded as formal because it's in a formal market space, and one is branded as informal and therefore illegal because it's happening outside of those designated spaces. And so you kind of have this creation and this separation as a way of trying to control who's able to trade, what kinds of spaces are able to be operated in, and therefore food becomes central to the spatial, the political, and the economic control of the city. And so when a city tells you that they have no authority over the food system and have no impact on the food system, it's somewhat confusing to us. Over time, what we've seen is that as the markets have become more liberalized, as the food systems become more liberalized in the kind of post-colonial era, the city still maintains its control on the markets, but sees it as simply an economic function and a spatial control function, and has no longer seen it as a food control function. Likewise, we see other kinds of things happening in African cities. So in one of the other cities we work in Kisumu, they have these general light nuisance bylaws that kind of shape what can be sold in the city. And these general nuisance bylaws are controlled by the Department of Public Health, and they trump everything. They trump economic development, they trump all those kinds of things. And so in this process, street trading is viewed as a risk to public health and is therefore sort of moved on constantly. So the cumulative effect of all of these sort of colonial laws and their unamended post-colonial frameworks has really been the creation of this kind of bifurcated food system and urban system and the production of informality. You know, we talk about kind of informal systems all over the place in Africa, but they are fundamentally shaped and developed and controlled by the planning system that has created it. And as we see now, the post-independent governments have tended to reinforce colonial plans and land management tools, oftentimes more rigidly than colonial governments. So Ananya Roy argues that the planning and legal apparatus of the state has the power to determine and when to enact the suspension, to determine what is informal and what is not, to determine what forms of informality will thrive and which will disappear. State power is reproduced through the capacity to construct and reconstruct categories of legitimacy and illegitimacy. So to deal with informality, therefore partly means confronting how the apparatus of planning produces the unplanned and unplannable. And so what we have is a food system that looks as if it is a kind of complex mix of formal and informal, looks as if it's largely ungoverned, and yet that ungovernability has been created by the planning structures that we've occupied, which therefore starts to raise questions about, well, how do we then start to insert a progressive food planning agenda into the African context, where these layers of planning legacy have shaped the very contestations we're seeing. If we layer on top of that, there's this new narrative around African cities. that's starting to, again, frame how the state's engaging with the food system. And so there's this kind of rise of Africa rising, revisioning African cities as future cities, and repositioning large private sectors as partners in development. And so where the state had previously been quite powerful, now the private sector is being welcomed in and is reframing and reshaping African cities outside necessarily of the control of the state. And so it's onto this kind of layer of colonial, post-colonial planning and this kind of narrative of Africa rising that I think we start to unpack why those decisions about Chisekone market have been so contradictory. And so I want to return us to Chisekone and come back to those issues and see how they play out and see how the kind of discursive practices emerge. So the upgrading. Why is the city so intent on upgrading Chisekone, even though there's all these challenges? The market itself is a curious place because the market itself, as gazetted under the Markets Act, is only 1.9 acres. The market itself now extends well over 15 acres. And it grew at a time of the collapse of the mining industry and the rise of informality as a way of surviving in the city. And so the city allowed the market to expand because it was the only way in which people were getting employment. But the vast majority of the market is technically illegal. And yet the city is allowing it to persist and is even upgrading it. So why is that? Through that Markets Act, quite a large power was given to the market associations. And through their paying of licenses, they've been able to gain some political legitimacy. And so they're able to make demands on the state through this payment of levies. And so the city is kind of doesn't like Chisekone market, and they view it as being an anathema to the modern city that they're trying to pursue. But they also recognize the historical power of these marketeers and how they are continuing to pay into the city coffers. And so there's this kind of tension and negotiation that's constantly in place. And they're recognizing the health and safety concerns, and the marketeers are raising the health and safety concerns. You can see the kinds of challenges that are in the market space and the necessity to improve. And then you have things like the outbreak of cholera, and it therefore is seen as being a risk that needs upgrading. So there's a logic to why the city is not wanting the market to exist but still supporting it. When we get to the relocation, well, this is another story. So we start to think about, well, who's driving the urban agenda? And what we've seen has been a reduction in the capacity of the state. The Kitwe City Council has very few resources, very few people. We go into the town planner's office, he does not have a computer. We ask to see the city's master plan, which still guides everything that happens in the city, but nobody's actually got a copy of it since the 1980s. So there's quite limited capacity of the state, and there's this recognition that they want to modernize, that they need to improve the market space. And so they've entered into a fairly extensive national government program funded by the EU around market development. And this markets development program from the EU recognizes a number of the problems that are in the markets. The proliferation of street trading, informal vending, the degradation of the environment, the deterioration of quality of life, and therefore there's the promotion of the development of these modern markets. These modern markets are completely disconnected to the logical spatial planning in the city. They're on the periphery of the city, they're far from where the wholesalers operate, they're far from where the transport infrastructure operates. They're these very isolated spaces. And yet there's a lot of money going towards these. You have a state that's undercapacitated, a state that doesn't really like Chisekone market, and then there's this capital and this capacity development support that comes in from the EU. So we start to see that the decisions that are getting made in the city are shaped in part by historic biases, shaped in part by historic planning legacies, but now increasingly by external funding and development agendas. We see this in all the cities we work in Africa. So we've got the power of the donor funding shaped by notions that have only partially formed in context. It's often happening in secondary cities where the state is even less capacitated. We've got the historical antipathy towards Chisekone. And the other reason that they want to relocate Chisekone, which I haven't mentioned before, is that land that they've expanded onto is commercially zoned. And the city has its eye on developing a new shopping mall in the city centre. Because historically, the city got its money from the marketeers, but the rates and revenues you can get from a shopping mall are so much higher. So there's an effort to relocate on the basis of that. And then the street clearances. If you remember, the framing of the Markets Act rendered the street vendors illegal and informal, and the market vendors formal. So we have this context of illegality to start with. We have this concern around crime and grime as it plays out in the urban public streets. And if you move those people into the markets, then you can control them better. So it's about control, it's about destroying illegality and informality and pulling it into a formalized system. But the street traders are also less politically aligned and less powerful than marketeers. They don't have that historical power, and so they have less voice in the system. Some of the market associations are even against the street traders because they see them as undermining, because they're not paying the levies and therefore they're undercutting. So there's an economics at play. And finally, the ShopRite shopping centre are arguing for the removal of street traders because they're detracting from their business. And again, formal businesses have much greater voice. And so suddenly these things start to make sense. We've also got to think about what the cumulative impact is and why these things come together. So if we're thinking about those three conflicting narratives, why is that happening? The first is that there's no obvious clear mandate for local government. The framing of the food issue has removed power from local government. There's an absence of state capacity. Even if they wanted to have a coherent plan, they wouldn't know where to start. So we've seen that decisions about markets are informed by actors who are made powerful by historical planning legacies, by the marketeers who've always had the status as a result of the Markets Act, the large-scale private sector actors who are coming in, the donor agencies. And as a result, cities are kind of increasingly pulled depending on donor funding and development objectives. And when you look at who is driving the agenda, none of them have a food systems or a food security mindset. It's about economic development. It's about order. It's never about food. And so we've got this kind of highly contradictory set of responses, ranging, as I say here, from tacit support to active repression, depending on the politics of the moment. And therefore, how do you as an actor in the food system respond to that constant uncertainty? Where are the places for any kind of counter planning? And of course, the story of Chisekone isn't the only thing that's happening in these cities. There's other dynamics at play. So across Africa, we're seeing the rise of the shopping mall. And the shopping mall signifies many, many things. So this is the shopping mall on the outskirts of Kitwe, the Makuba Mall. And the president opened the mall. And look at the language that's being used. The mall serves the need of a growing segment of our urban citizenry that's evolved, become more cosmopolitan and global in their exposure and preferences, and have more disposable income and options. The argument is that the Chisekones of the world, the street traders, are part of a backward African city, and we are now evolved beyond that. Our citizens deserve multiple fast food joints. And so again, this kind of mall is the symbol of development, but also the mall as this bringer of capital opportunities into the city, the rates that are getting paid by those mall developments. And so you see this kind of narrative rising. But oftentimes it's based on a kind of urban fantasy that bears very little resemblance to the reality. So this is an architect's design for a shopping mall in Kisumu in Kenya where we've worked. And this is the reality of the shopping mall in Kenya where we've worked. And you get to see that just the way in which there's this kind of promotion of a particular idealized type of life. There's not a very vibrant street life. There's motorized transport. There's no securitizations, open space. What we have here is some car parking space. I can tell you this road is full of tuk-tuks, which are little informal taxis, of boda-bodas, which are bicycle taxis. There's very few private cars operating on this road. The place is highly securitized. All the infrastructure suggests something very different to what is being promoted. And yet this is the investment vision that's being sold. This is what's driving urban change in African cities. And so often the development is driven by private developers and not by any kind of comprehensive planning. And what you end up with is this system of kind of independent buildings that are set up which are completely at odds with the environment around them. So Hungry Lion is a fast food chain, South African in origin, that has been plonked right next to the market space. And you can see the kinds of mismatch. And this is completely off the planning agenda. And when different agencies like the FAO work on food system plans, their food system plan includes Chisekone, it includes the small-scale farmers around the city. It does not speak about the shopping mall, it does not speak about the rise of these, it does not speak about what is driving the urban development agenda. And then we have this series of what I call food insensitive planning. We have rapidly changing diets in the African context. We always think about the food insecurity as hunger and malnutrition. Now we're seeing an increased dietary transition, increased rise of obesity and all those other challenges. And it's often thought of as a kind of rich person's disease. When you become wealthy, you move to a city and you eat worse, etc. But Dave Shirley's work has shown that the most rapid dietary transition in in East African cities is taking place in households with incomes of less than $2 a day. The food system of the urban poor is changing rapidly. It's not an indication of wealth, but an indication of the intersection of a changing food system with long-standing poverty. And so if we're trying to think about food system planning, we've got to think about the material conditions that the urban poor live in. Those market sites are really important. The kind of rise of the shopping mall is really important. But again, it's also about that material condition. And so we go back to that plate of food from Kitwe. Diets are not inevitable. They're shaped by infrastructures at all levels. And so when we're thinking about planning, it might not necessarily be about planning for food spaces, but planning for spaces in which food is occupied, in which food is consumed, in which food is produced. And so this is the plate of food, and these are the conditions under which that food is produced. We're looking at households that have no internal kitchen, households that are dependent on a charcoal burner to produce a meal, no refrigeration, no storage, no electricity. How does that then shape the diets that people are consuming? This is the kind of traditional diet that plays out, but in the context of a rapidly changing food system where more and more highly processed foods are entering to the market, you can see how this then becomes a site ripe for transformation. You know, we look at the kind of multidimensionality of poverty in these households. And so it's not enough to simply think about poverty as a lack of income, but also as a lack of clean water, as a lack of medical treatment, as a lack of fuel to cook, and how all those things are then shaping what people are consuming and what they're able to do. And so if you're thinking about a food security intervention that has its base in urban planning and urban design, well then maybe the provision of basic infrastructure is actually the most impactful thing you can do. We think about the kind of trading conditions and planning. So these are all snapshots of different kinds of food retail that happen in the neighborhoods in which we work. We have the guy whose job is selling cooking oil in units that are decanted to what people need. But you also have the dried fish seller, and each of those little black spots are flies. You have, inadequate storage capacity for traders. You have unsafe trading conditions. You have inadequate transportation for those traders to accurate, which he was, excuse me. You have poor transport infrastructure that shapes what people are able to do. And so, when we're starting to think about planning and food, what kind of basic infrastructure do the vendors need in order to deliver the kinds of foods that people should have? Got wider infrastructure planning issues. This is a snapshot from Kisumu. But what we see is that there's been an awful lot of investment by major development agencies and bilateral donors into infrastructure, into particularly transport infrastructure, and the rise of the kind of mega highways that connect African cities to ports. But there's been very, very little focus on infrastructure within cities and infrastructure between cities and their peripheral areas. So when we work in Kisumu in Kenya, on the east end of Kenya, we find that the eggs are being imported from Uganda. Now there's many reasons for that. One of the reasons the eggs are coming from Uganda rather than from the neighborhoods around Kisumu. Partly it's around agricultural trade policy and the ways in which Uganda subsidizes chicken feed, which makes the chickens a bit cheaper. But part of it is around transport. You can get eggs without breaking them from Uganda to Kisumu because there's the highway. You cannot get eggs from the neighborhoods around Kisumu to market without them breaking because of the infrastructure. And so, what kind of equitable infrastructure is required in order to enable food to flow into the cities? Because we have all these challenges, and we have this rise in the triple burden of malnutrition. Across Africa, you see this combination of overweight, anemia, and stunting. And it's happening rapidly. We're seeing this rapid rise in the availability of ultra-processed foods. This is just some figures from Anne-Marie Tho's work. Just have a look at those changing rates of imports. We are seeing a significant increase in the availability of snack foods and soft drinks into the African market. This is kind of indicative of the change of the system. We're seeing a rapid change in the structure of retail. This is just a snapshot from Cape Town, and in Cape Town it is exaggerated, but just showing in 1994 how few supermarkets there were. Each green dot represents a supermarket. By 2013, there's this veritable explosion. The food system is changing fast. The products that are coming into the food system are changing. The manifestation of the retail sector is changing. And it's not simply the formal system that's changing. This is an informal vendor in Epworth in Zimbabwe, and you can see the kind of the fresh produce and the traditional bags of roasted peanuts are getting crowded out in that picture by the increased presence of ultra-processed foods. And what we have is a context in which the conditions of lived poverty have created an environment that is ripe for the nutrition transition. And therefore we need to think about different ways of impacting those urban spaces that's going to have some kind of vanguard of resistance to that. And yet, despite all of this, food remains off the planning agenda in Africa. And that's there for a number of reasons. Part of it is around these historic framings that have viewed food insecurity as a production issue or viewed it as a poverty alleviation issue that needs to be dealt with by household scale interventions, and rather thinking about these bigger questions. I'm not sure how influential the SDGs are in the American context, the Sustainable Development Goals, but in the African context, our governments are wrapping themselves in knots to try and work towards the SDGs. And SDG 2 is the goal to end hunger, to achieve food security. Not once within that goal is the urban mentioned. And so when you're thinking about what's driving the national agenda in thinking about food, and what's driving the absence of food thinking in urban areas, it's got to be that. SDG 11, which is the urban goal, doesn't mention food. And so food is remaining off the planning agenda. We've also got a few concerns about the framing of food in the New Urban Agenda. The New Urban Agenda is a document that's meant to set the urban agenda for global cities. And it's the first time that food is mentioned as a basic service in the same breath as talking about water and sanitation. And yet I don't think its framing really helps us to deal with some of the nitty-gritty of actual urban scale planning and suburban scale planning. It talks about the territory, it talks about the region, it does not talk about the markets, the street traders, those kinds of things. We look at the Resilient Cities 100 indicator framework. So this is something that 100 cities have signed on to. It's meant to help them assess how resilient their cities are. One of the components they look at is food. And there's 3 indicators, and the urban food access indicator is how close a community is to a shopping supermarket or a fresh produce market, but there's no definition of what a fresh produce market is. So there's this kind of narrative of the food desert playing out in this global framework that cities of the north and south are meant to be reporting into, and it's framing the food access issue as one about supermarkets. And so we've kind of got a food framework that isn't working towards addressing, to my mind, the urban food problem in Africa. And so to get propositional, this is some of what we're trying to do in the Western Cape, in South Africa. We're working quite closely with the provincial government of the Western Cape. And some of what I'm talking through here is the direct outcome of conversations we've been having with Tristan Gergens in the office of the Department of the Premier. And they've developed this Nourish to Flourish framework. And it's basically a strategic framework for household food security. And if we look at what they're proposing, they're actually proposing in Pillar 3 developing food-sensitive planning and design guidelines for provincial land use management. And so we have this open opportunity to start saying, well, okay, in an ideal world, how would we start to get food onto the planning agenda? What would it take? And what is different to what's being done elsewhere in the global north? And I think the first thing is we need to take seriously how the planning community and how the governments engage with informality. Planning, as I said earlier, echoing Ananya Roy, planning created informality. It created that binary between what is considered formal and what is considered informal. But the modalities of formal processes and informal processes are very different. This is a slide from Paul Barosh. So you see, formal processes start with planning, move into services, construction, occupancy, and informal is much more insurgent. It begins at occupancy and then works its way up to planning. And how do you start to bring those two very different worlds together? So Shatkin says, if we're going to think about city making, we've got to think about how these things are countered by actually existing urbanisms that are rooted in alternative social dynamics, of informality, of violence, of alternative cultural, of social visions, of vote bank politics that resist some of the planning norms that we're used to talking about. How do we then start to think about planning in a space that is so shaped by informality? My colleague Vanessa Watson says if we're going to start thinking about planning for the global south, the new work needs to start with the following kinds of assumptions. And this is a long quote, so if my reading gets stumbly, forgive me. New work needs to start with the following kinds of assumptions and see how these compare to the kinds of planning assumptions we have normally. We work with the idea of states that are weak, of fractured, of probably corrupt, and state functionaries who will seek to use planning systems for financial and political gain. Civil society, which is not a source of democracy, but is fractured by economic and political decisions, may be based on criminal activities and functions as an instrument through which claims on the state are directed, sometimes in violent form. Community organizations, which may choose to engage with the state and assert their demands through court challenges, street demonstrations, or the destruction of property rather than through dialogue. New concepts of citizenship, which are based on a sense of entitlement, and where there's a consciousness of the rights but not the responsibility. NGOs and social networks, which function not so much to build social capital, but rather to serve their own interests of power or profit, sometimes in collusion with state functionaries and property developers. Decision-making processes where power cannot be wished away, but will be a dominant factor shaping all forms of engagement, and where consensus is a possible but unlikely outcome. Processes where participating parties are driven by very different and usually conflicting rationalities, which shape expectations and outcomes, and planning interventions where the expertise of planning professionals is under direct challenge, where state sources of information like maps and statistics are treated as suspect, and where communities, or elements of these, will want to take control of knowledge and idea production. And so this is a very different entry point for thinking about planning. How do we deal rigorously with these very different conflicting rationalities that are at play? And in the food system, where there are these such strong contestations, this is a very real challenge. And so the work we've been doing with Province has been arguing this. The planning needs to take its kind of role and its share of the blame for some illegal development and inadequate state service provision. But simply addressing planning will not address the situation. We need to put planning in its context of wider urban governance and urban management, and these processes of wider decision making, and recognizing there are some areas in which the state has very firm control, such as these planning mechanisms which really speak to formal food processes. But then there's all this other kind of fuzzy decision making space that's all around urban governance and urban management. And planning is a part of that. And so we need to think about how we engage those things. And we've got to think about these all as part of the kind of basket of levers. And in order to bring this together, we need to find a way of animating local politics to engage this and to speak to these issues. And so kind of in that context of thinking about planning as part of the totality of urban governance and urban management, Tristan has put together this schematic of the ways of building food sensitivity into planning. And some of it is about generating entirely new things into the planning sphere, and some of it is simply inserting food into existing processes. And the idea is that there are innumerable ways in which we can start to get food-sensitive planning into the system, be it around a set of specific urban design guidelines which then prompt developers to think differently, putting food into the provincial spatial development framework, which is the major planning mechanisms that's meant to guide all kinds of spatial planning. And if you can insert just the language of food into that, you can start to embed it. All developers in South Africa need to produce an EIA, an environmental impact assessment. Do you have those here? Yeah. And so the EIA. And if you can get the food impact embedded in that, sure, developers will find ways to circumvent it. They always do. But at least they have to account for how they're circumventing food as an issue. Trying to just say to the Department of Housing, Transport, Public Space and Recreation, if you start to think about food, it may not have any real impact on the fiscus of your development projects, but it may have profound impacts. Adding city-region food systems planning into the system. Inserting food waste as a waste component. All these things that trigger a slightly different way of thinking. Putting food into informal settlement upgrading. So the idea in all of this is that we start to foster a sense of foodness in planning and start to slowly change the apparatus. But it doesn't just happen. Okay, so how are we starting to try and move this from a theory, from a nice set of ideas that may or may not be possible, to trying to bring it into the material life of our cities? And so the first one is we need to get buy-in from policymakers. We need to have the decision makers, political and technical, of the cities that we're working in buying into this. And the one thing we've been trying to do is unpack the mandates, identifying what actually is the mandate of local government and how does food intersect with that. So in the South African context, we have the right to food as a constitutional right. And that right is meant to be recognized by all spheres of the state. We have yet to have a testing of the right to food, and it's kind of slowly building. And what we're doing is trying to unpack, so what is it that's within the municipal government purview that impacts the right to food? And there are movements afoot to try and take local government to court around their way in which they're impeding the right to food through planning. So unpacking those mandates, revealing to the state what their job actually is, because many times that has not been well understood. Unpacking the costs of inaction. So the Western Cape provincial government has looked into the fiscal cost of the double burden of malnutrition and realized that it costs the state at least 5% of GDP per annum. And when you start to layer that with this identification of mandates and opportunities, the idea is that potentially it provokes a shift. But you have these stubborn mindsets around what is the role of the state and what the food system looks like and how it works for people. So we've been going on a process of taking officials on learning journeys, taking them out into the street, asking them to disavow themselves of any existing ideas and just experience the environment. And slowly, I think we're gaining traction. Because only then are you able to speak to municipal officials about getting planning in place. There's a lot of groundwork to be done. We've got a longer term commitment to provincializing planning. At the African Centre for Cities, we house the Association of African Planning Schools. And one of the things is a long-term gain is to try and do curriculum reform to try and shift some of the stubborn realities of planning. And one of the things we've done is we've developed a food systems planning toolkit, which has just gone live. It's quite a technical resource, but it's at least there to provoke thinking within planning schools. And then the third component is around community engagement beyond public participation. We're mandated by law to have public participation in all processes, but that public participation is generally a kind of rubber stamping. How do you start to have meaningful public participation? Because Edgar Pieterse, who's the director of our unit, has argued that to do urban management and politics, you've really got to foster a commitment to societal learning through agonistic engagement and continue agreement to take the next step, recognizing that this is difficult, this is contested, we're working with conflicting rationalities, but only by engaging that, only by really working at that space, do you create an opportunity for any kind of substantive, informed, and politically embedded long-term perspectives to emerge. There's a real necessity to work with the communities that, I mean, this is all really self-evident to people working in Buffalo. To people working in our context, not necessarily so. So how do you really start to get that public engagement? And so one of the things we've been doing is working as part of a community of practice, of generating this group of people from business, from private business, from government, from academia, and from civil society, to get in a room to talk about developing a shared understanding of the food system issues and the potential governance levers that may exist. It's not about decision making at the moment. It's not about putting in planning regulations at the moment. It's about getting a shared understanding and sense of trust amongst the key actors. And so that's really where we've been working. The other one is to develop accessible research outputs. Thinking about, if you're going to get change in cities, you need to have buy-in from civil society. And that's not just the urban poor. We've got to find ways to influence the middle classes, because they are the ones who agitate often. And so it's about putting out books. Can you just hold the book up quickly? Yeah, so one of the things we've done recently is put out this book, which is a popular rendering of our findings, as a coffee table book. And it's sort of generated quite a lot of conversation in Cape Town. We've had various sort of media engagements, radio, not yet TV mercifully, but it might be coming, but also doing kind of other kinds of community engagement processes around that. And so thinking seriously about how do you translate the research into something that's accessible to people and can be used as a way to provoke conversation around these issues. And then finally, engaging in community-led research processes. Because again, if you have a community that's capacitated and understands the context in which they're working well in the language of the state, then there's real potential for change. And so it's around developing that community capacity to engage the state. And so we're thinking about, food has been off the planning agenda officially for so long. And we seem to be moving towards a space where it's possible. And in some ways, we're quite excited because no one owns food politically. There's no government department that seems to think they have a mandate on it, unlike things like housing and water and electricity. There's nobody in the community who sees themselves as the food person. And so because nobody owns it, there's maybe a chance to have these kind of new insurgent conversations emerging and a way to move it forward. But likewise, there's no strong champions of the thing. So we're in a tricky space, but I feel like we're getting somewhere. Because the reality is that the way in which food moves in our cities, the way in which food is controlled or not controlled in cities, fundamentally shapes so many aspects of our urban lives. It shapes employment, it shapes the experience of housing, it shapes transportation, it shapes the kind of environmental consequences of the food systems in which we're operating. And our belief is that fundamentally, if we start to get food onto the planning agenda, it can open up a whole series of new conversations about how to make cities more responsive to the needs of the citizens. And that is where I will close out. Thank you.
Oh, that's excellent. Thank you so much to Professor Battersby for this really interesting talk. I think I learned so much about urban change, which is really underlying a lot of the issues that you brought up, and how we deal with urban change through governance and food provision and so forth. I had the good chance to visit Kenya a couple of years ago, so some of the images that you showed were a little bit different. But I think while the audience and students are thinking of the question that they might ask, I'm the lucky guy with the microphone, so I could ask the first question. I wonder if you could expand on the context of the income or wealth gap that is going to dictate people's decisions and realities for taking care of their food provision at the market versus the modern shopping mall that's coming around. When I was visiting, I did get the chance to see both the traditional market and the new shopping mall, which were coming up in sort of strange urban locations in Nairobi or so, I thought.
Yeah, so I mean, there's this kind of narrations coming through. So that we've got the rise of the shopping centre, we've got the rise of the supermarket, and this notion is that those are simply places for the wealthy. And I kind of contest that a little bit. So in our work, we found that the lower income households, they're still getting about 25% of their food from the supermarkets. And so what seems to be happening is that people are shifting their purchasing patterns ever so slightly. So historically, what you'd do is you'd buy your day-to-day food from the street traders, and then you'd go to the central market once a month or so and buy your kind of your maize meal for the month or whatever. And people seem to be shifting towards the supermarkets and treating the supermarkets like they used to treat the wholesalers. We're also seeing some curious dynamics with a number of the street traders are also using the supermarkets as wholesalers and buying from there. So the supermarkets are not necessarily directly the source of food for people, but oftentimes they are indirectly. People do view the supermarkets in a kind of aspirational sense. There is this kind of aspiration to shop there because it symbolizes those things that President Lunga was talking about, symbolizes being modern, being cosmopolitan. But what we've found, we've actually got a video on our website, is even if they're selling the same product, they're selling something quite different. And you have to be in a certain category in order to appreciate that. So if you buy, I'm going to get it right, tomatoes, not tomatoes. If you're going to buy tomatoes on the street, the tomatoes you buy are these rich, juicy, ripe tomatoes. They're fresh from the market. They need to be eaten that day, otherwise they'll turn into mush. The ones that you buy at the ShopRite are small and green and hard, and they're going to keep in your fridge for a week or so until you need to use them. But it assumes that you have that kind of storage, whereas the people who are buying from the street are going to buy for that day. And so there's very different, even if it's the same product, there's very different logics of how you're going to consume it. And so it's tied into these different ways of how you live and move and have your being in a city that shape how you encounter those spaces.
So we're very happy to take questions from the audience now for Professor Battersby.
Hi, I would like to ask about slum development programs in Africa, because I'm from India. In case of India, there are slum development programs, but the slum developments are done outside the city or where there is no economic growth. Mm-hmm. And very far from the market, so that the people don't prefer to stay in the developed zones. Instead, they live in their own slum creations, informal slums. Is it the case for Africa also? It's a little bit different. So our urban densities are not as high as the Indian urban densities by any stretch, I don't think. We are seeing efforts to do in situ upgrading in some of the lower income areas, so in situ provision of infrastructure rather than kind of entire regeneration. There are not many housing projects that are being designed by the state at all. So it is kind of much more an organic growth process. In the South African context, we are seeing a lot of state provision of housing on the periphery of the city and alienation, and you are then seeing this informal densification process, either by people kind of, what we call it shack farming, where you have a house that's got a backyard and somebody will rent out land and put 2 or 3 shacks on it. So we have that kind of process. Increasingly, we're seeing a really new process by which there are various companies doing quite low-cost loans to homeowners who are then building on top of their houses and putting on like another 2 layers of apartments in order to do that. So there's this kind of change in how urban development's happening, and again, it seems to be much more driven by insurgency than by state. And so we've got to raise these questions about insurgent planning and how do you plan all other kinds of state provisioning in the context of these kinds of processes that are being ungoverned. Yeah, I think so.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I wondered if there's currently any city or local government that is beginning to kind of redefine the role of informal markets, or maybe an example that other cities should aspire to or begin to consider.
We have not seen a lot of that in the African context, to be honest. There's this deep-seated antipathy towards them. There are glimmers of hope in Windhoek in Namibia, where there seems to be a much more proactive state engagement with the informal trade sector. What we've seen in most places has been an effort to develop what they're calling hawker malls, where you remove the street traders and put them in these controlled retail environments. And it's an idea that's failed in Latin America and in Asia, and is probably set to fail in the African context as well. But it does all seem to be underlain by this deep antipathy particularly towards street traders. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that amazing presentation. I too actually grew up in the UK and I attended Warwick University. I didn't have the pleasure of going to King's College, but I really enjoyed just learning about the unbalanced agriculture policies you mentioned in terms of trade, and then really just additional challenges. But just throughout the presentation, I kept asking myself, well, Zambia doesn't have a dictator. They're not in civil war. Why are they in this condition? Like, why is the country this poor? And so I just quickly Googled in terms of how much copper deposit they had, and it looks like, according to Google, they're the 9th richest copper deposit country in the world, and I didn't even know that. So I guess with that, it's already an economic engine itself. So I started to think about, well, why is it that we have, I think you mentioned the number of people that were at least lacking access to clean water, and just having like 40 million of its residents living on $1 a day, etc. And I think some of the underlying issues might be the fact that the country itself only gained independence in 1964. So when we talk about the growth of a country, I think it's also important to mention is the historical components that really either deterred or crippled the country. So in terms of the copper, I think it was the British and the Belgians that really exploited the country and were the main beneficiaries. So with that, I guess for the next 35 years up until today, 2019, the country is still suffering economically. So what does this really mean for the people of the country? Is this something that you're going to also explore, just the implications of colonialism and understanding those implications?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, colonialism really frames everything. It frames the kind of national agricultural policy. It shapes the export orientation of the system. It shaped the colonial planning of the cities themselves was really around the control of native populations. And so that is fundamentally clear in that system. What has happened subsequently was, obviously the structural adjustment policies that again sought to kind of, again, around export orientation, around really trying to trying to consolidate the state, and really lost a lot of civil society capacity, state capacity, an economic rationalization that increased urban poverty exponentially. The privatization of the mines led to high unemployment, and so there's been this real deficit of economic activity driven by international development agendas, which is why to me it's so concerning now that you have the EU Markets Act, EU Markets Programme, kind of again redictating how the city should develop, and not informed by really what are the drivers. We also have to acknowledge that there's significant government corruption in the system, but again, oftentimes that corruption was kind of grounded and founded in the colonial structures, and so it certainly is something that there's an ongoing problem in these countries. Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Malik. Do you think with trying to implement food planning in these African cities, would it not disrupt these traders' way of life? Because a lot of these traders, what they quote unquote is considered illegal with selling their goods on the streets, but for some of them, this is their way of life. And don't you think trying to move them and disrupt where the market is going to affect their livelihood?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're trying to argue is that you can't import these kind of planning norms from elsewhere. You've got to think about what it is that's in the food system that's working in the interests of the urban poor, and how to make that work better. So we're talking actively about, well, how do you start to incorporate and think about working with the informal traders to generate conditions that help them work better. So in the context of the South African city, for example, we've found there's a number of traders who occupy spaces around transport interchanges, and oftentimes they're selling quite unhealthy foods. Now there's two ways to address this. The one way is to try and regulate that system. The other way is to try and think about, well, how can you enable that system to provide better food into the food economy? And so then it might be around, well, do you provide preferential trading base for people who are selling healthier food? Because all the informal trade policy is simply economic policy, and so whichever's the kind of most economically viable remains. But are there ways to reduce levies for people selling healthier food, to improve passive storage capacity so that people's food doesn't go off, so they are able to sell healthier food? So it's more about working with, and therefore this is why we need to have kind of community-led research processes that talk about what actually works in the system, and trying to revise and rethink how we think about planning and urban governance in order to enable that to work better. But it's a good question, because I think so often we don't really understand the potential negative externalities of any actions that we take. And when you're dealing with very vulnerable people, are these risks you can afford to take? And that, I think, is one of the challenges the state has to engage. Yeah.
To what degree does the presence of expats in the community drive the development of supermarkets or shopping malls that aren't necessarily for the local population?
Yeah. So I think that the initial takeoff of those retailers has been impacted quite profoundly by that. So some of the things we've seen in Lusaka, some of the things we've seen in Nairobi certainly started first in those areas where the expats are, but they are spreading out. And I think actually the moment the driver is not necessarily the demand. The driver of this change is about these notions about what a good modern city looks like, but also about financial investment and about the financial returns that come back to local government from those kinds of things. So there's a bit more of and I think there's an oversupply of these retailers in the system, and it's got nothing to do with demand. And although there might have been this kind of spark from the expats, I don't think that's what's driving it anymore. It's much more about an economic agenda.
What do you think are the key sticking points that are preventing these food systems from being able to develop more robustly so people can get healthy food? Because it seems like there are so many other problems that are related to it, including, as you point out, refrigeration and electricity to provide for the refrigeration and all those other technologies. So how would the government then coordinate itself more? How would you want the government to coordinate itself better to provide those kinds of services that enable it to develop?
Yeah, that is a really challenging question, because we've been arguing that you need to have a whole of system approach, and that is incredibly difficult to coordinate. So two things we've been working towards are, one, having a kind of pilot site in which you test out these ideas and try and bring together the different departments that might be able to work towards that, just as a way to see if any of these things are viable, and then roll it out. The other thing is to develop a kind of wider strategy and implement one unit at a time. But I think in order to get this to shift, it's the technical part comes much later than the shifting of the mindsets with the policymakers and planners. And I think that comes about through these processes like learning journeys, through these processes like recognizing the costs of inaction, but also through examples of good practice from anywhere else. But at the same time arguing that these are not replicable, but there are sparks of things that could be different. But it's going to be a very slow and incremental process, and I think if we get anywhere, we're going to make many more mistakes than I'd like to, but one has to try.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I'm here. I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about the role of trust, especially as you're trying to move towards working with the communities and kind of bridging the gap between community and government and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and in that very long Vanessa Watson quote that I read out, we do have these histories of state repression, these histories of lack of trust, these histories of communities also reneging on their agreements with the state, and so, I think these processes are going to take long and are going to have to be very carefully curated. And I don't think something like a food policy council will work in our context because the conflicting rationalities are so great. So one of the things I think is that there is actually a distinct role for academics within this to play a role as boundary agents, as trust brokers, as bearers of the responsibility of holding these things together, and people who are committed to being in these processes for the long term. And so I think it's I mean, I'm trying to do job creation here, but I do think there's a role for academics in these processes. And again, I think this is going to be a process in which a lot of learning has to take place, and a lot of principles of engagement have to be set before you start. But
we have a question up there.
Hi, my name is Gangan Kim. I'm sophomore in here. I'm really honored to meet you, since just a month ago I used your book as a citation, which is Urban Food Insecurity in Cape Town, South Africa, because I did a case study of Cape Town. Back to the question, the realistic urbanization of Africa remaining a different urban fantasy than the one seen in the presentation that we've seen from your presentation, because of the crime and other deep-seated issues. Why are so many African local governments obsessed with urban fantasy, even with the continued failures?
yeah, so why are so many African governments obsessed with these kind of modernist fantasies? I think part of it is, you know, in some ways we've bought into the narrative of Africa rising and the kind of narration of this African middle class that's rising up. When you kind of probe the data about what the middle class means, it's often people earning more than $2 a day, which is not middle class by any kind of realistic notion. I think it's an idea that has been sold to African governments by developers, has been sold to African governments by donor agencies, etc. So I think it's something that's exogenous, but I think also it is the obvious trajectory of some of the planning norms that we've had. This kind of notion of creating an orderly city, and the way in which we're going to move forward is that. And you know, so the case in point is looking at Rwanda and how their kind of city plan for Kigali bears very little resemblance to reality. But I mean, I'm wondering if it's a bit of a build it and they will come kind of idea. So the idea is that if you have these kinds of things, it attracts greater development and investment. So, you know, I go back to Venice in the Renaissance era, where people would dress very grandly in second-hand clothes and give the impression of a city that had opulence and wealth in order to attract traders in. And I'm wondering if there's something around that. If we self-promote, then it will serve as an attractor. I think it's kind of got these multiple layers to it, but it does seem perverse.
We have time for just a couple more questions.
Sorry. Thank you for the presentation, by the way. I really enjoyed it. I wanted you to shed some more light on a subject you already kind of spoke about, within like communities that are, in a sense, not of, you know, the economic wealth of the new malls and commercial establishments like Hunger Line that you spoke about. Do you see a separation in terms of the market, being that there are vendors there that, you know, kind of live off of their livelihood of, you know, selling food throughout the market, after regulations that are inputted to make the food, in a sense, a more healthier for the more environment? So I was just wondering what kind of market do you see happening within about like a 5-year context? Is it going to be a separation economically mostly?
Yeah, I mean, I think my sense is that the markets as they are will continue to exist, but we will see the kind of expansion of the supermarket model, and the formal fast food vendor will become increasingly present. I think we might see an increasing shift towards more globalized products, because actually we kind of have this mindset that the formal sector is providing kind of globalized food products into the market, and the informal trader is all dealing with local. But when we've looked at where food's coming from, it really isn't the case. So some of the street vendors in Kitwe are selling fish that's coming from China. A lot of the vegetables are coming from South Africa. So they're operating within a globalized system. So those global transitions in trade are going to shape what's being delivered. I think the functioning of those markets will largely remain, and you will see a bit more of a dominance of people going to the supermarket for a wider variety of products. So at the moment it's largely going to the supermarket for non-perishables. I think there's indications that is slowly shifting. But what I suspect is going to happen is that as those supermarkets become more and more dominant, they'll put greater and greater pressure on the state to regulate the informal sector around it. And so you might kind of end up with kind of a spatially more bifurcated system. And that's a concern as the trade has become more and more spatially marginalized or contained within hawker malls. That's the trend.
We have a question here, then a question against the window, and then we'll be just about out of time.
Hi. Went off. Okay, there we go. I was interested more in the moving from theory to practice, considering that, especially in South Africa, that they adopted the human right to food nutrition, but it seems as though the governments are still not necessarily acknowledging that right. So I guess what have community partners and academics and individuals working in food systems, what have they done to kind of bring light to those issues to governments and say, hey, this is a real issue, you've signed on to this, you've ratified this document, but there's so much more work that needs to be done?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so very little. So it's the kind of forgotten right in the Bill of Rights. We've not had anyone make a claim in the Human Rights Commission about the right to food yet. And part of it is this notion that food is something that's delivered by the private sector and therefore is not an obligation of the state. Part of it is the language that's been used around food security and nutrition, that, you know, if you are failing to feed your family, it's more of a moral or an economic failing and nothing of the state. And so we're kind of in this impasse where the right is there, it's a paper right, and nobody's yet mobilized around it. But we are starting to see the emergence of a food sovereignty movement who have written their own food charter and their own food policy that is entirely independent of the government food policy, and they're starting to mobilize around that. And then there's the work that's happening in the Western Cape, which is around trying to make that right visible. The challenge is that many people do not understand that they have the right to food. Unless somebody is going to raise that issue, it's not going to come to the fore, which is partly why we're trying to do community engaged research and work with communities to understand that the reason that they are struggling to feed their families is not a moral deficiency or not simply a condition of poverty, but it is shaped by these things of the state, and therefore trying to, okay, we're not trying to foment a revolution, but some kind of action would be nice. And I think slowly it is coming to a head. So just last month, the Legal Resources Council in South Africa held a 2-day seminar in trying to think about, well, what is the right to food and where are the levers? But the challenge is, so I know I'm rambling here, but the challenge is that at the moment the right to food is quite nebulous because it's just a paper right and it has no justiciable meaning until it's taken to court. But once it's taken to court, it has a very specific application. So if it's about the loss of farming land and how that's implicated on the right to food, then that is the way in which the state can engage the right to food, and they can say everything else is not the right to food. This is the case. But there's some really interesting lessons to be learned from the Indian case around the right to food and how they kind of mobilized for that over the years, and it was a long process before it became really evident. So long. Yeah.
Hi. I want to know what your thoughts on food security in Africa. That's about it.
Generally.
Yeah. Like, yeah.
Listen, we have exceptionally high levels of food insecurity. I think the manifestation of food insecurity is changing fairly rapidly as it turns from simply being about hunger to about these kind of more challenges around having access to an adequate diet. There is a big concern about the language of food insecurity and how that has been generated as a kind of quite apolitical technical challenge. So the 4 pillars around availability, accessibility, utilization, and stability often render themselves liable for kind of having a techno-fixed sort of set of solutions. And so the food sovereignty discourse that's coming through is arguing much more for community agency and taking on the kind of systemic drivers is gaining traction. I personally think that both have value in thinking about how we address the problem. But as it is, most of the policy solutions to addressing food insecurity remain stuck in this rural productionist mode of if we just produce enough staples, we'll address the problem. And that simply is not the fact. And so my argument is that there's a role for all spheres of government and all departments to work towards that solution.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank Professor Battersby for her visit and her lecture. We've got some great intelligence from her about food planning and food security in Africa and beyond, and we're very devoted to the work she's doing and want to continue to follow it. She's come a long way, so we would like to thank her for coming to and share her intelligence with us and have a look at the work that we're doing here in Buffalo. So please help me thank Dr. Battersby for today.